Hand over your root encryption hardware tokens right now. Walter, or corporate security will escort you to the curb." Julian sneered, shoving my dismissal letter across the polished mahogany table. I did not raise my voice, nor did I reach for the heavy glass tumbler sitting between us. I simply picked up my pen, signed the receipt of termination, and placed my physical access badge down on the mahogany surface. Julian smiled, convinced he had just streamlined our departmental operating expenditure by eliminating my $220,000 annual salary. He had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, the proprietary security certificates holding our $450 million cloud infrastructure together were set to expire, and my private personal repository was the only place the renewal keys existed. My name is Walter Vance, and for 15 years I served as the chief systems architect at Veloce Cloud Systems. When I was hired back in 2011 at 37 years old, Veloce was operating out of a cramped, windowless floor in a suburban office park with 12 racks of overheating servers and 3 enterprise clients. Over the next decade and a half, I designed, built, and maintained the company's entire zero-trust microservice architecture. I personally wrote the core cryptographic data pipeline that processed over 40,000 transactions per second for top-tier financial institutions and healthcare networks. By the spring of 2026, Veloce had grown into a behemoth valued at $2.4 billion, managing over $450 million in annual recurring revenue across 140 enterprise client accounts. I had sacrificed my weekends, my holidays, and my personal life to ensure that our system uptime remained at 99.999%. In the tech industry, infrastructure engineers are like plumbers in a skyscraper. As long as the water flows seamlessly, nobody remembers your name, but the moment a main valve bursts, everyone demands to know who built the pipes. I never minded the lack of executive spotlight. I took immense pride in the bulletproof architecture I had crafted from scratch. However, the corporate climate at Veloce shifted radically 6 months ago, when the board of directors announced the unexpected retirement of our veteran chief technology officer. Rather than conducting an external executive search or promoting from within our seasoned engineering team, Chairman Lawrence Vance used his voting majority to appoint his 34-year-old nephew, Julian Vance, as Senior Vice President of IT Operations. Julian possessed a pristine business degree from an elite university, expensive tailored suits, and an absolute absence of technical competence. He spoke fluent corporate buzzwords, throwing around terms like cloud optimization, aggressive headcount rationalization, and agile synergies, without understanding the fundamental physics of distributed database clusters. From his very first week on the job, Julian viewed me not as the foundational architect of the enterprise, but as an expensive relic of legacy management. I was 52 years old, earning $220,000 in base salary alongside a contractual performance bonus structured into my original 2011 employment contract. That contract explicitly granted me an annual equity allocation and a double multiplier severance package under Clause 14B if terminated without cause. Prior to the vesting of my remaining $850,000 in corporate equity to a young executive obsessed with inflating his quarterly EBITDA margins to secure a 7-figure performance bonus, my salary and contractual perks were prime targets for immediate cost-cutting. The initial friction began during an executive infrastructure review meeting in early April. Julian presented a slide deck proposing to cut our cloud security redundancies by 40%, effectively eliminating our secondary geographic failover servers in Virginia and Oregon. He argued that maintaining hot Stanby server clusters was a colossal waste of capital and that shifting all workloads to a single cloud region would instantly save the company $3.2 million annually. I immediately raised my hand in front of the entire management panel. I pointed out that our primary enterprise client contracts, specifically our $35 million annual agreement with Apex Financial Group, mandated strict compliance with SOC 2, Type 2 framework regulations, and federal data resiliency standards under Section 1030 of Title 18 of the United States Code, Removing our hot standby failover clusters would place Veloce in direct breach of our service-level agreements, exposing the firm to immediate contract termination penalties and massive legal liability. Julian's face flushed red with visible irritation as I explained the technical reality to the board. He cut me off mid-sentence, suggesting that old-school engineers were overly paranoid and resistant to modern cost-efficiency models. He asserted that his financial projections had already been reviewed by junior financial analysts who confirmed the risk was negligible. I stood my ground, presenting the physical audit documentation and reminding the board that our proprietary cryptographic data pipeline was built on a zero-trust model, requiring dual-key authentication, which relied heavily on our multi-region server topology. That meeting established a clear line of conflict between us. Julian realized he could not intimidate me with corporate rhetoric, and I realized that Julian was willing to gamble the operational stability of a multi-billion-dollar company simply to make his short-term metrics look impressive on paper. Over the next 2 months, Julian began systematically undermining my authority within the engineering department. He bypassed me to issue direct orders to junior developers, demanding they bypass security code reviews to push unvetted feature updates straight to production. When senior developers came to my office complaining that Julian was forcing them to work 70 to 80 hours a week while bypassing standard regression testing, I stepped in to block the unverified deployments. I logged formal internal compliance tickets with HR manager Brenda Cooper, citing severe operational risks and potential regulatory breaches under federal data privacy standards. However, Brenda was fully aware of Julian's familial connection to Chairman Lawrence Vance. Every ticket I submitted was quietly marked as resolved without investigation, or routed into administrative black holes. By early May, Julian had grown tired of my continuous resistance to his reckless initiatives. He knew he could not force me to resign voluntarily, as doing so would forfeit my $850,000 in unvested equity. Instead, he began constructing a paper trail to justify firing me for insubordination, completely unaware of the underlying technical dependencies that kept Veloci's platform online. He mistook my calm demeanor for weakness, failing to realize that the most dangerous man in a technology company is the quiet engineer who holds the master keys to the digital fortress. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in mid-May. Julian summoned me to the executive conference room on the 10th floor. As I walked in, I noticed that HR manager Brenda Cooper was already seated at the end of the long glass table, looking uncomfortably at her folder of documents. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping espresso from a white porcelain cup with an air of triumphant arrogance. He did not invite me to sit down. Instead, he tossed a single page onto the center of the table. It was a formal authorization document instructing the engineering team to immediately disable all secondary cryptographic verification modules across our enterprise database clusters, and to hand over all physical hardware authentication tokens to his office. Julian explained that he had hired an external offshore software contractor to handle system maintenance at 1/3 of our internal team's labor cost. To enable this offshore team, Julian needed master root administrative access to our proprietary cryptographic core. I looked at the document and then looked up at Julian. I explained calmly that the core cryptographic framework was not standard commercial software owned outright under a generic work-for-hire clause. Back in 2011, when Veloce lacked the capital to fund custom security development, my original employment contract included a specific intellectual property addendum under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code. That addendum specified that while Veloce held an exclusive operational license to use the cryptographic data pipeline, the underlying root master encryption architecture and personal repository credentials remained registered under my name as an independent developer patent. Furthermore, granting third-party offshore contractors unencrypted root access without individual zero-trust hardware token verification was a direct violation of federal cybersecurity mandates under the Defend Trade Secrets Act. I told Julian plainly that I would not sign the document, nor would I transfer master repository access to unverified external entities. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits. He set his espresso cup down with a sharp clatter against the saucer. He warned me that my refusal constituted direct defiance of an executive command and gross insubordination. He claimed that as senior vice president of IT operations, he held complete authority over all company technology assets, and that my insistence on holding personal cryptographic keys was nothing more than an illegal attempt to hold the company hostage. I pointed out that the contractual licensing terms were legally registered with the company's legal counsel 15 years ago and were re-verified during our annual compliance audit every November. If Veloci wished to purchase the master root architecture outright, the contract specified an independent valuation purchase price of $2.5 million. Short of that purchase, or a formal licensing agreement renewal, the master encryption keys remain securely stored within my private hardware-isolated repository. Julian turned to Brenda Cooper and gestured sharply. Brenda cleared her throat and handed me an envelope containing a formal notice of termination for cause. The document cited gross insubordination, failure to perform assigned technical duties, and deliberate obstruction of corporate operational efficiency. By terminating me for cause, Julian was attempting to achieve two specific financial objectives. First, to strip me of my $850,000 in unvested corporate equity. And second, to void Clause 14B of my employment contract, which mandated a double multiplier severance payment of $1,200,000 in the event of termination without cause. Julian leaned across the table with a cold smile. He demanded that I surrender my company laptop, my security badge, and all physical hardware tokens immediately. He stated that corporate security guards were waiting outside the conference room doors to escort me out of the building like a criminal. He added that if I attempted to access any company servers or modify any system code from that moment forward, Veloci's legal department would file immediate criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I looked at Julian for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the table, nor did I display a single trace of anger or panic. In corporate chess, when your opponent makes a catastrophic tactical blunder based on incomplete information, you do not interrupt them. You simply let the board play out. I pulled my ballpoint pen from my jacket pocket, calmly signed the acknowledgement of termination notice, and pushed the signed paper back toward Brenda. I looked Julian dead in the eye and said a single word: "Understood." I stood up, unclipped my company identification badge, and placed it neatly beside the unsigned root access transfer form. Julian appeared visibly taken aback by my complete lack of resistance. He had clearly anticipated an emotional outburst, a tearful plea for my job, or a heated argument regarding my denied severance package. My calm, deliberate response rattled his confidence for a fleeting second, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Two armed corporate security guards escorted me down the elevator to my ninth-floor corner office. As I packed my personal belongings, my favorite ceramic coffee mug, a few family photos, and my personal technical notebooks, my engineering team stood around in stunned silence. Junior developers looked on with wide eyes as the guard stood by the door. Victor Miller, a senior database administrator whom I had mentored for 8 years, stepped forward with a worried expression. Victor asked quietly what they were supposed to do about the upcoming annual SAW-C2 compliance audit scheduled for Monday morning, as well as the routine 72-hour cryptographic key rotation protocol. I placed my hand on Victor's shoulder and told him softly to follow all official written instructions issued by Vice President Vance, to document every administrative directive in writing, and not to alter any automated background scripts. Once my box was packed, security escorted me through the main glass lobby and out into the heavy afternoon rain. As the glass doors locked behind me, I walked to my car, placed the box in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 2:15 on Thursday afternoon. Julian believed he had just eliminated an expensive salary and asserted his absolute dominance over the IT department. What he failed to comprehend was how distributed zero-trust systems actually operate. When I walked out of that building, I took no company data, copied no proprietary code, and touched no company servers. I complied with every single word of his termination order to the absolute letter. But back in 2011, when I built the automated security framework, I incorporated a mandatory 72-hour cryptographic handshake protocol designed to verify the active digital signature of the lead systems architect. Because Julian had revoked my corporate access credentials, while without executing the proper executive key transfer protocol or renewing the master software license, the automated root system would interpret the absence of my personal cryptographic signature as an unauthenticated security state. In exactly 72 hours, at precisely 2:15 on Sunday afternoon, the primary zero-trust microservice architecture would automatically execute an isolated security lockdown, revoking all active database encryption tokens across the entire cloud platform. The countdown had officially begun. On Friday morning, while Julian Vance was boasting to the board of directors about saving the company $220,000 in annual payroll, I was sitting in the high-rise law offices of Bennett and Associates in downtown Chicago. Across the polished oak desk sat Arthur Bennett, a veteran intellectual property and executive employment attorney with 30 years of corporate litigation experience. I handed Bennett a thick leather folder containing my original 2011 employment contract, the attached Section 106 Intellectual Property Addendum, the written notice of termination for cause signed by Brenda Cooper, and the recorded transcripts of my internal compliance warnings. Bennett spent 45 minutes carefully reviewing every clause, highlighting key paragraphs with a yellow marker. When Bennett finally put down his pen, a quiet smile spread across his face. He explained that Julian's attempt to fire me for cause was not only legally frivolous, but constituted a textbook violation of contractual good faith and fair dealing. Under Clause 14B of my employment agreement, terminating an executive architect without providing a 30-day written opportunity to cure alleged performance deficiencies automatically reclassified the dismissal as a termination without cause. This immediately triggered the double multiplier severance obligation of $1,200,000, payable within 14 business days. Furthermore, Bennett reconfirmed the legal status of the master cryptographic core. My 2011 addendum explicitly stated that Veloci's right to utilize the root zero-trust encryption pipeline was conditioned upon an active, valid licensing agreement tied to my personal master developer repository. Because Veloce had formally repudiated the agreement by terminating my access without executing the statutory buyout clause of $2.5 million, Veloce was currently utilizing my proprietary intellectual property without legal authorization under federal copyright law. Bennett advised me to remain completely silent and take no action whatsoever. He instructed me not to send any emails, answer any phone calls from Veloce management, or touch any personal terminal connected to external networks. As Bennett noted, malicious compliance is the most lethal tool in corporate law. By strictly obeying their order to cease all interactions with company systems, I was allowing their own procedural arrogance to execute the technical consequences. While I was enjoying a quiet lunch with my wife, chaos was quietly assembling at Veloce Cloud Systems headquarters. On Saturday morning, Julian brought in his newly hired offshore contractor team to begin overhauling the database cluster configurations. Ignorant of the underlying zero-trust security dependencies, the offshore team attempted to bypass our internal code review firewalls to push mass configuration changes across the network. Every time they attempted to modify a core microservice, the architecture requested a valid, hardware-authenticated digital signature from the chief architect's root key. Unaware of how the system was built, Julian instructed the offshore engineers to force override the authentication prompts by rewriting the master system registry. They failed to realize that forcing an unauthenticated override on a zero-trust architecture was classified by the automated core as an active cyber breach attempt. On Sunday afternoon at precisely 2:15, exactly 72 hours following my dismissal, the automated cryptographic countdown expired. Across all 4 primary cloud regions, The root encryption pipeline initiated a fail-safe security isolation protocol. In an instant, the zero-trust microservice architecture revoked all active database decryption tokens. The core data pipeline, servicing 140 enterprise clients, suddenly transformed into an impenetrable 25/6-bit encrypted vault. To external client applications, Veloci's cloud platform did not crash or go offline. Rather, every API request returned a cold, standardized system error response. Authentication credential revoked by root authority. The first catastrophe struck our largest enterprise customer, Apex Financial Group. Apex relied on Veloci's infrastructure to process over $12 million in automated weekend trading settlements across global markets. At 2:20 p.m. on Sunday, Apex's automated trading algorithms lost connection to Veloci's data pipeline. Over 30,000 transaction calls per minute failed instantly, leaving tens of millions of dollars in financial settlements trapped in unverified memory buffers. By 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, Julian's personal mobile phone began ringing relentlessly. The chief information security officer of Apex Financial Group was demanding an immediate emergency conference call with Veloce executives. Simultaneously, automatic alert notifications flooded the mobile devices of every member of Veloci's executive board. Julian rushed to the office in a panic, calling in senior database administrator Victor Miller and the entire internal engineering staff for an emergency weekend assembly. When Julian arrived at the 9th-floor server control center, the red alert monitors were flashing across every wall-mounted display screen. The main dashboard showed 98% of all client database connections frozen in an encrypted standby state. Julian screamed at Victor Miller to manually override the encryption lock and restore client data access immediately. Victor calmly opened his terminal, pulled up the system diagnostics, and pointed to the root authentication logs. He explained to Julian that the entire infrastructure was locked under master zero-trust encryption keys registered exclusively to Walter Vance's root hardware repository. Victor informed Julian that because my administrative credentials had been revoked and my digital signature had expired without a valid key rotation, the system had automatically entered a hardened security lockdown. There was no backdoor, no administrative override, and no master password bypass built into the code. The only way to unlock the system was to apply a valid, cryptographically signed renewal token generated by my private hardware repository. Julian refused to accept the reality. He ordered the offshore contractor team to brute force the encryption layers or rebuild the entire data pipeline from scratch. Victor looked at Julian as if he had lost his mind and quietly informed him that brute forcing a 25/6-bit AES zero-trust encryption framework would take approximately 4 billion years using every server on the planet. As the sun began to set on Sunday evening, Chairman Lawrence Vance called an emergency executive board session. Apex Financial Group had just issued a formal legal notice threatening to terminate their $35 million annual contract and initiate a $50 million breach of contract lawsuit by 9 o'clock Monday morning if full system operational capacity was not restored. The multi-billion-dollar enterprise that Lawrence had spent decades building was standing on the precipice of total collapse, all because his arrogant nephew wanted to save $220,000 on an engineer's salary. By 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the glass-encased headquarters of Veloce Cloud Systems felt less like a tech firm and more like a disaster zone. The scheduled annual ASO Key 2 Type 2 audit team from Enterprise Risk Compliance Partners had just arrived in the main lobby. Instead of finding a smooth, compliant enterprise operation, they walked into a chaotic nightmare. Over 40 Tier 1 enterprise client accounts were bombarding Veloci's customer support center with frantic calls. Stock analysts had caught wind of Apex Financial Group's frozen trading data, causing Veloci's pre-market shares to plummet by 17% within 45 minutes. On the executive floor, Julian Vance's mobile phone was showing over 100 missed calls and dozens of urgent text messages from furious board members, institutional investors, and corporate attorneys. Julian tried frantically to dial my personal mobile phone at 8:15 a.m. However, as instructed by Attorney Bennett, my phone line was automatically forwarded to Bennett and Associates front desk. When Julian's call came through, Bennett's legal assistant calmly informed him that Mr. Walter Vance was currently represented by legal counsel and that any communication regarding Veloce Cloud Systems must be conducted formally through his attorney. At 8:45 a.m., Chairman Lawrence Vance personally took over the phone line. The arrogance that had characterized the executive suite for months was completely gone. Lawrence pleaded directly with Arthur Bennett for an emergency face-to-face negotiation meeting at 9:30 a.m., promising that Veloce's full executive leadership team would attend and that all options were on the table. At 9:30 sharp, Chairman Lawrence Vance, Julian Vance, and HR Manager Brenda Cooper walked into the executive conference room at Bennett and Associates. Julian looked completely disheveled. His designer suit was wrinkled. His tie was loose, and dark circles shadowed his eyes after a sleepless night of panic. I sat calmly at the head of the conference table beside Arthur Bennett, dressed in a comfortable gray wool sweater, sipping a warm cup of black coffee. Before anyone could even sit down, Julian burst out in a desperate, accusatory rant. He pointed a trembling finger across the table at me, shouting that I had intentionally sabotaged the company's cloud network, planted a malicious logic bomb in the system code, and was actively committing corporate extortion in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He claimed he was going to report me to the Federal Bureau of Investigation if I did not immediately unlock the servers. Arthur Bennett slowly stood up, leaned forward, and placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. His voice was icy, quiet, and absolutely authoritative. He instructed Julian to sit down and hold his tongue before he dug himself into a prison sentence for making false criminal allegations. Bennett pulled a thick binder of system log printouts provided by Victor Miller through formal discovery subpoenas and laid them out neatly on the table. Bennett explained to the board that there was zero sabotage, zero logic bomb, and zero unauthorized system access. Every single action taken by Walter Vance following his termination had been 100% passive compliance with Julian Vance's explicit written order. Bennett walked through the timeline step by step for Chairman Lawrence Vance. On Thursday afternoon, Julian had terminated Walter Vance for cause, revoked his administrative credentials, and ordered corporate security to escort him from the premises. Walter had obeyed every single directive. He had touched no company servers, modified no code, and taken no proprietary files. The lockdown that occurred on Sunday afternoon was the natural, automated operational result of Veloce's own zero-trust security architecture, which required a valid 72-hour cryptographic handshake. Julian had been warned in writing during the April infrastructure review meeting about the multi-region cryptographic keys, yet he chose to ignore technical reality and fire the only licensed architect capable of signing the security certificates. Bennett then turned to the legal ownership of the core technology. He presented the original 2011 Section 106 Intellectual Property Addendum, alongside the official registration certificates from the United States Copyright Office. He pointed out that Veloce's authorization to use the master cryptographic data pipeline was legally tied to an active, unbreached licensing agreement. By terminating Walter without cause, while falsely claiming cause to evade severance, Veloce had materially breached the contract, automatically revoking their operational license. As a result, every single gigabyte of data currently processed through Veloce's platform was an unauthorized infringement of Walter Vance's registered software architecture under federal copyright law, carrying statutory damages of up to $150,000 per willful infringement. Chairman Lawrence Vance turned slowly to stare at his nephew. The color drained completely from Julian's face as the overwhelming reality of his incompetence finally settled in. Lawrence realized that Julian had not saved the company $220,000. He had placed a $2.4 billion enterprise on the brink of immediate liquidation to satisfy his own ego. HR Manager Brenda Cooper sat completely motionless, realizing that her participation in constructing the fraudulent termination for cause notice made her personally liable for corporate gross negligence and bad faith employment practices. Chairman Lawrence Vance sank back into his leather chair, breathing heavily. He looked across the table at me with tired, defeated eyes. He asked what it would take to restore full operational capacity to Veloci's cloud infrastructure before the stock market opened for main trading at 10 a.m. Arthur Bennett opened a crisp white folder and slid a formal settlement agreement across the mahogany table. Our terms were straightforward, absolute, and non-negotiable. First, Veloce Cloud Systems would immediately issue a formal written retraction of the termination for cause, reclassifying my departure as an executive retirement without cause. Second, Veloce would pay the full double multiplier severance package mandated under Clause 14B, amounting to $1,200,000 in cash. Third, Veloce would accelerate the immediate vesting of my $850,000 in corporate equity shares, purchasing them back at full market valuation. Fourth, to grant Veloce a permanent, non-exclusive corporate license to utilize the Zero Trust Master Encryption Core going forward. Veloce would execute the statutory buyout clause of $2.5 million. And fifth, as a strict condition of settlement, Julian Vance must be immediately relieved of all executive authority, removed from the IT department, and terminated from Veloce Cloud Systems without severance. Julian gasped, sitting up in shock. He stammered that Uncle Lawrence could not possibly agree to such outrageous demands. Chairman Lawrence Vance did not even look at his nephew. He looked at his watch. It was 9:42 a.m. Apex Financial Group was 18 minutes away from filing their multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and the stock market opened in 48 minutes. Lawrence picked up his pen and signed the settlement agreement. At 9:46 a.m. on Monday morning, Attorney Bennett's chief financial administrator confirmed that the wire transfer from Veloce Cloud Systems had successfully settled into the firm's escrow account. The total payment amounted to $4,550,000, comprising $1,200,000 in double multiplier severance under Clause 14B, $850,000 for the full market buyback of my vested equity, and $2,500,000 for the permanent intellectual property license buyout. Once the funds were verified by the receiving bank, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy titanium hardware token. It was my personal, air-gapped cryptographic signing key, the single physical artifact that held the master digital signature for Veloci's entire cloud network. I connected the token to a secure, isolated terminal in Bennett's office, entered my personal master passphrase, and generated a newly signed 24-month cryptographic renewal certificate. I hit send, transmitting the encrypted authentication payload directly to the primary hardware security module at Veloci's central data center in Virginia. The impact across Veloci's infrastructure was instantaneous. At 9:48 a.m., the automated Zero Trust data pipeline received the cryptographically validated root signature. Across all 4 cloud regions, the red alert indicators vanished from the monitoring dashboards, replaced by solid green status lights. The frozen microservice databases decrypted seamlessly, reopening the transaction pipelines for all 140 enterprise clients. At Apex Financial Group, 30,000 pending trading operations cleared within 90 seconds. When the main stock market bell rang at 10 o'clock a.m., Veloci's pre-market stock drop quickly reversed course, stabilizing as news broke that the brief weekend system maintenance anomaly had been fully resolved. In the conference room, Chairman Lawrence Vance stood up, handed Julian his coat, and instructed corporate security to escort his nephew out of the building immediately. Julian attempted to speak, to offer an excuse, or to appeal to his uncle one last time. But Lawrence simply turned his back. The young executive who had entered the company 6 months ago, full of unearned swagger, walked out under guard, his reputation in the technology sector completely destroyed. HR manager Brenda Cooper was instructed to submit her resignation by the end of the week. The corporate board realized that her failure to enforce proper compliance procedures and her willing compliance with Julian's bad faith firing had exposed the firm to existential financial ruin. Following the crisis, Chairman Lawrence Vance promoted Victor Miller to Senior Director of Infrastructure Engineering, ensuring that the department would finally be led by a skilled, principled engineer who understood the value of technical integrity. Victor called me that evening to thank me for protecting the engineering team and ensuring their systems were legally and technically bulletproof. As for myself, I walked out of Bennett and Associates into the bright morning sunshine of downtown Chicago, feeling lighter than I had in 15 years. At 52 years old, with $4.55 million in liquid capital sitting safely in my accounts, I was completely financially independent. I had spent 15 years building a digital empire in the shadows, making sure the pipelines never leaked and the servers never failed. When an arrogant corporate executive thought he could treat foundational expertise as an easily disposable line item, he learned the hard way that true technical mastery cannot be faked, bullied, or stolen. My wife and I packed our bags that weekend for a long overdue 3-month vacation in Europe. Standing on the balcony of a quiet seaside hotel overlooking the Mediterranean, drinking a glass of cold white wine, I checked my phone one last time. An automated notification from Veloci's system monitoring group flashed briefly on the screen. System status: 100% operational. Zero Trust Core active. I smiled, muted the notifications forever, and put the phone back in my pocket. Corporate chess is a fascinating game, but there is nothing quite as satisfying as watching the board collapse under the weight of a fool's own arrogance, while you walk away with the prize.